Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session of this week's book club. My name is Teresa Young, and I'm the operations manager here at Trauma Research Foundation. And we would like to welcome you and let you know that we're really glad you're here. Before we dive into this week, I just want to take a moment and do a little PSA on two upcoming programs. The first is the TRF Traumatic Stress Studies Certificate Program, and it's for anyone with an interest in treating trauma. It teaches how trauma impacts the brain and body, the efficacy of a wide array of clinical treatment methods to apply in your practice to improve your clinical treatment. This program is about 7 months long, and it's all offered online, and we offer it twice a year. The coursework is self-paced, and you have the opportunity to have monthly Q&As with different experienced senior supervisors. The next session starts actually in 4 days on February 14th, so you still have an opportunity to apply. And the second one is the International Trauma Conference, which is now in its 33rd year. And this year, we're actually going to be back finally in person, and it will also be offered online. Early bird tickets are available until April 19th, and we're going to have speakers like Basil Vanderkolk, Esther Perel, Ruth Lanius, Martin Tescher, Rachel Yehuda, Richard Schwartz, and many more. Feel free to visit our website for more information. And over to you, Whitney, to kick off this week's book club. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Whitney Yolkinen. I'm one of the session hosts, and I'm so glad to be here for our fourth meeting. A little about me is I live in Utah with my 12-year-old son and my husband, Sam, and have worked in, I'm a social worker who has worked in anti-trafficking and child exploitation for many years, and also I'm a crisis clinician. Have always kind of focused my area of study on trauma, and I have a big desire to contribute to a more trauma-informed community and society that is more empathetic and compassionate towards one another. And so I'm so glad to be here.
Thanks, Whitney. And I'm Brendan O'Hara, your other session host. And a little bit about me. I live in Salem, Massachusetts with my little dog. And I'm an athlete who does fitness challenges to raise awareness for PTSD and treatments mentioned in this book because they mean so much to me. I'm also a freelance graphic designer, photographer, and writer, doing work with nonprofit organizations like TRF, who I recently wrote a blog post for. And I also work with the sports, retail, and technology industries. So we'd also like to welcome all of our panelists and our book club members joining live on YouTube. Our panel is selected from our book club members. So if you'd like to participate in the live discussion as a panelist, please submit the panel questionnaire form that you have received in your welcome email when you join the book club. And if you are on the YouTube, if you're joining us via YouTube, if you'd like to participate in the live chat, please just click the red subscribe button, and then you'll be able to participate in the live chat. Okay, so we'd like to introduce our panelists, and we'll start off with Corinne Hoover. And Corinne is from Elkhart, Indiana. She is currently on her trauma journey. For years, she has had intense physical health problems. A doctor suggested the book, The Body Keeps the Score, to her because he thinks the issues she is having are related to trauma. She struggles more physically than mentally, but after reading this book, she realized so many things that she didn't realize about her trauma. So welcome, Corinne. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And next, I'd like to introduce Carolee Barrett. Carolee lives in Southend-on-Sea in the UK and works as a children's mental health practitioner. She is also a trauma survivor and counseling student. Her connection with the book is being recommended for her own healing journey and using it for her work with clients. So glad to have you.
Thank you.
Next is Janine McConaughey. Janine is a retired educator who now serves as the president of the board for the Trauma and Attached Network ATN. She has authored 3 books on the effects of childhood trauma, providing hope for healing. She first read The Body Keeps the Score after entering therapy at the age of 61, as she began to understand the effects of developmental trauma. Welcome back, Janine.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And next is Mary Simmerling. Mary is joining from Quebec, Canada. Mary is a philosopher, artist, and writer. The Body Keeps the Score has been transformational in understanding the impact of trauma on individuals and communities, and the significant limitations of the current accepted and codified mainstream medical diagnostic criteria and treatment modalities, as well as being an incredible source of hope and optimism that there is the potential for healing and trauma. And Mary has been so great helping with our chats each week. We're really glad to have her. Thank you.
And next is Nadine Talley. Nadine is a licensed clinical social worker currently in private practice in South Jersey. Nadine has spent the majority of her career working in residential treatment programs for youth and experienced the impacts of trauma for these youth and families in very intense ways, often feeling inadequate and ill-prepared to provide the effective treatment. Nadine attended a training by Dr. Van der Kolk in 2008 and was immediately drawn into learning more about his work. Reading this book dramatically shifted the way Nadine has conceptualized treatment and engaged with clients. Nadine is exceedingly grateful for Dr. Van der Kolk's body of work and how this book has supported her professional development into a more effective clinician. Welcome, Nadine. Glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. And next we have Frederick Mann. Frederick lives in Metro West, Massachusetts, and works for UMass Chan Medical School, focusing on trauma-informed and responsive organizations. He partners with organizations to become trauma-informed and responsive. He came to this work through his interest with resilience and finding meaningful ways to engage people who need help to overcome what happened to them. And we're so glad to have him back. Thanks. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Good to see everyone.
Next is Terry Freiberg. Terry holds a PhD in social psychology from UCLA and a JD from Harvard Law School. Freiberg is a leading authority and writer on chronic loneliness and has had 2 books win Best Book of the Year in Psychology and Psychiatry, 4 Seasons of Loneliness from 2016, and Surrounded by Others and Yet So Alone in 2020. He is general counsel and on the board of directors for TRF. Thank you for joining us, Terry.
My pleasure.
And next we have Hania Hakil. Hania was born and grew up in Poland. She is currently based in Portugal, where she focuses on creating online and offline healing programs rooted in community and connection. The book was a guiding help when working with people with refugee backgrounds, helped her understanding their trauma symptoms from a body-oriented perspective. And we're so glad to have you. Welcome.
Next is Edward Mooney. Dr. Edward Mooney is a professor of educational psychology and a researcher in school shootings and violence. He is also a survivor of childhood physical abuse. Welcome, Dr. Mooney.
All right, and next we have Jenny Willoughby. Jenny is a writer and speaker whose viral blog post detailing the abuse she suffered at the hands of her ex-husband launched a national scandal involving the White House. Jenny is based in Manhattan and writes and speaks on the topic of self-compassion and abuse recovery, specifically as it relates to domestic violence and the ACE factors contributing to increased risk of interpersonal violence. So glad to have you. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you for having me.
Next is Caitlin Phillips. Caitlin is a Scientia PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales and the Sydney Children's Hospitals Network, studying the impact of medical trauma in children. She is performing an fMRI study of how children respond neurobiologically and emotionally to different images. She recently read The Body Keeps the Score and has found it applicable to her life and more broadly. Welcome, Caitlin.
Great. And Naima Mokhtar. Naima lives in the UK and is a survivor of narcissistic abuse and now a mentor in local charities and hosts online events to raise awareness about narcissistic abuse, complex PTSD, and codependency. The Body Keeps the Score has been instrumental in her recovery and training. Wow, thanks so much for being here.
Next is Jason Mark Yates. Jason is a singer-songwriter. Jason's connection is that he has CPTSD and started a charity for partners of survivors of rape and sexual abuse from 2003 through 2009. Welcome back, Jason.
Hi, everybody.
And Nance Kent, I'd like to introduce her. And Nance lives in Minneapolis. Nance is gender non-binary and queer, pronounced they, them. Sorry, thank you for clarifying on that. A retired early childhood teacher, a parent, and a lifelong social justice activist. They love The Body Keeps the Score as a critical tool for somatic healing and much needed connection. So glad to have you. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we will proceed on to some guidelines and expectations. Please be gracious with differing opinions. And please take space and leave space for others. Panelists, just a reminder to please keep shares under 2 minutes per question. And whether you're a panelist speaking or a book club member communicating in the YouTube chat, please remain on topic. And just to let you know about the schedule, this is the book club schedule. We'll be offering 4 books to read per year. Each week will consist of 4 to 6 weekly virtual discussion groups, with the final week being a discussion with the book's author. And this week we are just we'll be discussing part 4 of The Body Keeps the Score, which are chapters 11 through 12, The Imprint of Trauma.
All right. And we'd like to just go over wellness recommendations. Be aware that there are some triggering topics in this discussion, and please feel free to take a pause if needed and take care of yourself. Get a drink of water. Another suggestion is stretch, do deep breathing. Also, your naming your senses can kind of help. You know, what you hear and see and feel and taste and touch, to come back to the present. It's a good grounding practice. So yeah, just make sure to take the time you need. And thank you. So question 1 we have, why do you think there continues to be disagreement in the field about the validity of repressed memories? And Carolee.
Hi. So I think that part of it is because when we remember these kind of events, it's not a full memory in the same way as other memories. And so the research that Van der Kolk did about talking about the majority of it depends on the emotions we felt at the time and the kind of personal meaning as well. And we might remember that part, the actual trauma, but we might not remember what happened afterwards. And so we can't integrate everything. And I think that's why there's been some kind of disagreement, because it's not remembered whole.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I like how he goes over, oh, sorry, I just kind of lost my train of thought. That point that you just commented on. I'm trying to find it in the book here, but just asking about the credibility of memories and how memories are kind of fickle, but I'm losing my thought a little bit on what I'll try to remember. But yes, sorry. Let's see. Caitlin.
Thank you. Yeah, I think part of the reason that there is some of this disagreement is I think a lot of it's been caught up in a debate about justice and sort of carceral approaches to people who have perpetuated trauma. And I think that that's why they're scrutinized so heavily. Like if we had another way of dealing with trauma and people who have realized that they've undergone abuse as children, perhaps we would be able to have this discussion in a way that was slightly more removed from that context. But because it's usually in a context which is this person who's now going to go to jail or something like that, they've been scrutinized in a way. And as Kiralee was saying, it's really hard if you are someone who's had this kind of recovered memory to give a reasonable account of something that's happened that you've repressed for years. So I think that there is disagreement just because it's just such a loaded field. And I think if maybe we had ways of managing trauma or acknowledging trauma that wasn't in this kind of justice setting, perhaps there would be more acceptance of repressed memories.
Good point. Thank you. Nadine.
Hi, thank you. One of the things that really stood out to me as I reread it, because I originally read the book when it first came out, so I had to brush up a little bit in preparation for today. And it occurred to me as I was rereading these chapters that I really appreciate van der Kolk doing such an amazing job of really giving us the full picture of the trajectory, so to speak, of our understanding and how we've both viewed and treated trauma in the field, and the importance of the political climate and the role that that plays into how people also process and receive this information. And being in America, obviously, we're, dealing with a lot of turmoil in our political climate now. And so it really resonated with me in a different way, how much we know that the political climate plays into public health issues across the board. And I think trauma is no different in this way. So I think that's a big piece, or at least here in the States, I think that plays a big role.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Okay, let's see, Nance.
Hi. Yeah, I think we talked about this last time. This sort of the difficulty of the fact that psychologists and medical people are humans, and the book talks about how in something like biology, you can say, oh, this organ is doing this, and this organ is doing, and even that's super complicated. But when you talk about the human mind, you're getting way complicated. And and there's this long history that he talks about in the book, even back to Freud, of when Freud realized that his patients, his women patients who he was saying were just hysterical, well, it turned out they were sexually abused. And then that got covered up because their parents were rich. And they're like, oh no, you're not gonna expose the fact that we sexually abused our kids. So I just think it's a question of literally denial and disassociation on the part of people in the field.
Yeah. Very good point. I love the section in chapter 11 where it's listening to survivors. And it says, nobody wants to remember trauma. In that regard, society is no different from the victims themselves. We all want to live in a world that is safe, manageable, and predictable. And victims remind us that this is not always the case. So I think it's so important to recognize that in ourselves and to not dismiss people's experiences because we feel discomfort in recognizing the truth of what can happen in the world. So yeah. Let's see, Brendan, do you want, or actually Teresa, can we hear from some of the comments on the YouTube Live?
Sure. I think people are just getting warmed up and chatting, but there's just been some commentary around the politics. So Julia said, politics has always had a role in how the treatment is either permitted or denied. And we have Lisa sharing that thinks that past trauma and those doing the studies are in denial of their past issues, or because they have not experienced the abuse, they can't understand it. Back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I had kind of remembered what I was thinking earlier, and it's the part where he says how accurate our memories are largely depend on how meaningful it was for us. And I found it very interesting, the study of the World War II veterans who, the ones that had PTSD, their memories were not modified and they stayed intact for over 45 years. And so, yeah, I think I just thought that was interesting. But Brendan, go ahead with the next question. If you
Sure.
Thank you.
Discussion question 2. In what ways might we increase society's knowledge about memory, dissociation, amnesia, and reenactments? And I'll read that one more time, just in case. In what ways might we increase society's knowledge about memory, dissociation, amnesia, and reenactments? Let's see. Janine, you have your hand raised.
I think that I wrote some notes here on that one because I thought about the fact that as I was the Body Keeps a Score was so crucial to me as I was healing, because it helped me to understand how my memories were intact. And as they were surfacing, especially with the help of EMDR, that I was seeing them as they actually happened and not revising them, which my stories that I told around them had been revised, but not the memory themselves, which had remained repressed. So I think that one of the answers to this question is to do more psychoeducation with clients so that they are able to understand what is going on themselves. Because one of the hardest things is to believe your own story, to believe your own truth, to not be easily dissuaded by you can't know that and that isn't true, or those who do deny that they actually did the abuse. And so I think that this chapter, so I had read it years ago, and when I reread it, I went, oh, that is what helped me. I understood how I was helped to believe my own story.
Thanks, Janine. Yeah. Let's see, we have quite a few hand raised on this one, so we'll try to get in as many responses as we can. Anya, yeah,
thank you. I am a deep believer of education that happens in our micro interactions in daily life, and this is the direction I would like to propose, that whenever something like reenactment or dissociation happens to me, I try to be very open about it with people around me, as simple as that, either my peers, either my family. A very recent story, my cat ran away, and it definitely triggered some very early childhood patterns of rescuing, saving from death important family members. And being able to name it, being able to explain it to my husband, to my neighbors, was like this education in a community. And that's my mission.
yeah. Thank you, Anya. That's fantastic. I think that's a wonderful way to increase society's knowledge about it, because I think, we enter the world and we sort of see the world through our own lens of our own experience, and those who haven't experienced trauma might not be able to empathize with those who have, and not realize what could trigger somebody to have a reenactment or a bad memory. So thank you, Anya. Corinne, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just find that, like, for me, I'm not a professional in the industry, and I didn't really realize my issues were trauma related until about a year ago. And then I started reading this book, and it really put it in perspective for me. But as I was reading it, I realized how many people I know this book, makes me think of. And I know more people that have trauma than I don't. And so I think it has to be mainstream for people to really pay attention to it. You know, one thing I came across is, you know, I didn't think I was having any mental issues whatsoever, until I started looking through court documents and realized that there were some major events that affect the way I do things that I completely forgot about. And I didn't even know that that was a thing related to trauma. And now that I've read this book, I'm telling everybody about it, and everybody that you need to really read this and look into it. And all of those people had no idea what I was talking about, you know, just like I had no idea until I read the book. And so I think it has to be more mainstream, to get the attention of people.
Thanks, Corinne. Yeah, I agree. And you know, Bessel mentions that something to the effect of in the book, there was he talks about how PTSD was originally referred to as shell shock, and then that was removed from the official psychology literature, and it was referred to something else later on, and then that was removed. So it seems like, you know, there are these times and instances where, you know, researchers try to push the word out there, and then it's been retracted. But luckily, you know, Bessel's done such a great job with this book, and other researchers have done such a great job doing this trauma research to put it out there, that it finally feels like it's starting to be pushed into the mainstream. But I still think we have a long way to go before it becomes officially mainstream. So so thank you for that. Frederick, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Also, I agree with everything everyone said. One of the things I also find very fascinating with this book is how Betzel really, he complicates very simplistic thinking around trauma and our ways of knowing. Like, I think he does an amazing job really talking about human nature. One idea he talks about is just the heaviness of the trauma. Like, talking about trauma in general is heavy and difficult for people to process. So he challenges that. He talks, I know there's one line where he says, it's on, he asks people to have the courage. It's on page 197. It says, cultivate the courage to listen to testimonies of survivors. Cultivate the courage. And so he talks about there's this human dimension that prevents us from processing all this. So he's challenging us to understand that when he brings in feminist theory and how feminist theory push against some of the I mean, it's so many ways what I am finding that this book really talks about, there's multiple ways of knowing. So he challenges one of the biggest ways of knowing that we have made it central, the idea that the scientific laboratory is the golden standard. He says on page I think it's on page 193, he says, many ways memories are not seen as valid in terms of the memory loss. It's because you can't do them in clean and pristine laboratories. And I think that is, we have to challenge our ways of knowing in the ways in which we are trying to put things in small boxes. And so I know I'm out of time, but this book offers so many complex entry points and challenges and curiosity. I think that helps.
Thanks, Frederick. Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's really a plea for empathy among society, with respect to people that have experienced trauma. And I thought Hanya's approach, like she mentioned before, about you know, in times of being triggered, talking about it and informing people about it is I just thought that was a fantastic approach. So thanks, Frederick. Edward, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I think that there is something deeper that we're struggling against. Having sat through many individual education plan meetings with students and parents, I saw a great pushback from families who did not want to acknowledge that their child was suffering from mental health issues, anything emotional or mental health issues is pushed aside. Well, there's nothing wrong with him. I can't tell you how many times I heard that. And I would like to point out that there's a current situation that is evidence for this. The Oxford, Michigan shooting. By the way, my background is in the trauma of school shootings. And the parents, there's lots of evidence that the parents ignored all kinds of terrible things that the son was texting and doing. And they just denied that their son had severe mental issues. So my gut feeling is that we have a society that does not wish to deal with these issues. I had a neighbor many years ago, when she found out that I taught educational psychology, said, that's all crap. They're only normal people and criminals. And I really think we need to educate society as a whole about what psychology and mental health and emotional issues truly are. I think people just immediately, if you break your wrist, oh, gee, of course, that's sad. Let's go to a doctor. But if there are emotional issues you're struggling with, I think we've stigmatized this to such a degree society-wide. Anyway, that's from my experience.
Can I make a comment on that too? I work with a lot of youth, and I have experienced the same thing with parents. And sometimes I almost wonder if the trauma responsive, as parents, we want to fix everything, but when we don't know how, shoving it away and invalidating our children's experience is a weird a maladaptive way of trying to fix. And yeah, it's interesting to observe and see, but I like your points. Thank you.
Thanks, Oprah. Karen, you have your hand raised.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Robinson. I'm a licensed clinical therapist and a transformation coach, and I've been in the field for 24 plus years. I'm also a personal survivor. What was striking to me about this question is we are now in the times where we have a lot of social media, we have podcasts. So I feel now, and I feel this way now in the past couple of years since, the pandemic, that those of us who are in the field and have recovered, when we're ready and when we can, it's so important to share our stories and stop pretending they didn't happen. We're very happy to help clients heal. It's so hard to really not only work on ourselves, but be public about that work. I think is a very vulnerable thing, and when you're ready, super important. So I think listening to podcasts and reading content about survivor stories is huge. And I also think too, whatever we can do to educate society that, a lot of times people think survivors are lying to get attention, or they dismiss us because of the lack of evidence, because the memories are so fragmented. And there's a really great quote in this book that I would like to read.
Please do.
It's on page 177 in my edition of the book. This is my fourth copy. I've loaned it to clients over the years and never get it back. This is my fourth copy. And every time I'm blown away with what I learn. Okay. But what I think this is about traumatic memories. Early researchers called these pathogenic secrets or mental parasites. I think it's very powerful language. And then the quote goes on to say, because as much as the sufferers wanted to forget whatever had happened, their memories kept forcing themselves into consciousness, trapping them in an ever-renewing present of existential horror. Like, does that sound like a good time? Like, does that sound like things that people want to lie about? So I think the more education we can, this is huge, the more education we can put out there, like, survivors aren't lying about this. Have there been people lie? Of course, but the percentages are so small. Let's look at what it really takes to go to court and tell stories. It's very brave. It's a vulnerability. And the more of us that can do that, we're helping the world by doing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Totally agree. And there was that section in the book that I found compelling about people who people who had experienced a traumatic event and submitted, I think it was a police report, and then years later they were asked about it, and they talked about a large percentage of those people that didn't even remember the contents of the report. And I love how Dr. Van der Kolk referred to traumatic memories as a mosaic of memories and how it is stored. I just thought that was such a good metaphor for how traumatic memories are not, they're stored and experienced so differently than just traditional memory of positive events. So we should check in with Teresa for the YouTube live chat to see what's going on there.
Right. Lots of great discussion. There's a really great thread going on just in discussion around parents. So Atara has said, working with parents, I've seen multiple parents deny children's issues in those meetings, but in private, will address stories of intergenerational trauma. And then another user with a numerical username says, I would bet that many of the parents who are in denial about their children have themselves experienced trauma. It's too scary for the parents to deal with their own past experiences. And then just shared, parents tend to take on guilt, shame, blame, etc. when they find out their children are ill, and that is where denial comes from. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I saw Edward giving thumbs up, very validating statements. So thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to discussion question 3, and I'll pass this over to Whitney.
All right, thank you. So question 3 is, can you think of any examples in your own life or the lives of individuals whom you know that relate to any of the concepts discussed in this chapter? Jason, love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to quote, I can't find I've got the Kindle version of Bessel's book, and it's got no page numbers. But just before Nancy's story, it really makes the point that people that, like myself and others that have gone through trauma, CPTSD, incest survivors, or anything like that, that we try to get people to accept that we're dealing with a dual reality, the reality of a relatively secure and predictable present that lives side by side with a ruinous, ever-present past. And I think that kind of goes over into some of the other questions we've looked at as well, as to why people might not believe it. With me, people always felt I was very together, that I knew what I was doing, that I could encourage people and look after other people. But what they never realized is how you're falling apart inside, because it's like a dual reality. And a lot of my trauma started before I even had speech. So it was practically in the womb at birth, before any of that. So a lot of my second kind of part of me is to do with emotions that are overpowering, because of the emotions as a child that were overpowering, that you couldn't even put a word to. I even struggle now with my therapist when she asks me how I feel. I don't know. I can know how you feel if you're upset, and I can help you. But to explain how I feel, it's like I'm not in touch with myself. And that's a really difficult thing, you know. But I call it the monkey on your back, because we know that very often you can live with this thing, and then you get to a point as you get older where you suddenly realize you've got to do something about it. And to me, it's like having a monkey on your back. You're walking around with this monkey on your back. You know there's something there. But when you decide to do something about it, that's when you look in the mirror and you see the monkey on your back. You know the monkey's not going anywhere. So you've got to kind of live with that monkey in a happy kind of, you feed him the bananas, if you like, to make him kind of live happily with you. So I think this is really a big thing, and what's already been discussed. We need to tell people how we feel. The psychotherapists are doing a fantastic job in helping people come out of themselves and understand what's going on. But the people that are actually going through the traumas, we're actually a resource. We're a resource for how this thing actually feels. You know, it's not a text it's not a paragraph in a book. It's how this thing actually feels. And if we're open about that, then we're going to help a lot of people understand it and just illustrate it, make it simple to understand. I said to my therapist only yesterday, I said, if you imagine a pair of glasses, if I take my glasses off, everything's blurry. I'm not in the room. If I put the glasses on, everything's clear. But guess what? I'm behind glass. So I'm not in the room. And sometimes you feel like that in life. You feel like you're here, but everybody else is really here and you're kind of just looking on. And yet people think you're doing great and you're fine.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult thing to even explain to people sometimes.
That's such a good point. And I think it kind of goes back to the invalidation of our experiences. A lot of kids I talk to who have gone through trauma, their stories are often invalidated because they're doing good in school or they're high performers, or and people can't grasp how both could exist at the same time in that duality. So I think that's really important. Thanks for your comments. Edward.
I was severely physically abused as a teen. I won't go into details, by my father. I want to talk about something that's difficult in our society right now. It's called toxic masculinity, but I prefer to call it fragile masculinity. You see, when I was a teen, you become unsure, am I a man? Because a boy wants to be known as a man. And my father was very abusive emotionally about that. Years later, when I was a high school teacher, a young man was in my room and we were talking. And all of a sudden, I saw something. I realized that I was resonating with this young man. His name was Aaron. I say that for a reason. I worked with him. I tried to get him to talk to me. He was always scared of me. And my students know that I'm an approachable person, and I couldn't break through. At the end of the school year, I received a call from one of his best friends. Aaron had committed suicide, and he left a note that said he couldn't talk about it because men aren't supposed to have these feelings. And it broke me because I struggled with that as a teen. Now I feel more comfortable that I'm a male person, but the adolescence going through this is very difficult. So the expression of traumatic stress is extremely difficult for teenage boys to do that, because boys are supposed to be tough. And I know I maybe use my minutes here. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. I hear that a lot too with the youth I work, those same sentiments, and it's really heartbreaking. Naima.
Yes, thank you. I just want to carry on a little bit about the question of repressed memory. This is exactly the reason. The recollection of a repressed memory from my childhood brought me to understand that I was in an abusive relationship. So I was in reenactment. And in the book, it was so heartbreaking to see that in so many cases, Bessel got involved. Justice was not served. I'm grateful that I didn't need any validation. I managed by myself to validate myself and my own experience. But when nobody around believe you, that's trauma piling up. How to get out of this? So that's
Thank you. Good point. It's very re-traumatizing when we don't feel understood or seen or validated in our experiences. See, Nadine.
I have so many thoughts. I'm going to try to organize them because you all have said such important things, and I really appreciate everything that everybody said. One of the things that I wanted to mention, I realize, and I'm touching a little bit on the last question, but I think it ties in. I have found that trying to talk to, whether it's families or parents or teachers or whoever it is, that I have to remember to use all of the same skills that I use when I'm working with a client, because at the end of the day, what this book has so beautifully illustrated is the importance of the neuroscience, right? And if we use that as our foundation and understand that anybody we're talking to might be coming at us with a layer of defense, and what that might be about for them, we may never know. And so if my ultimate goal is to really say, how can I get this person to understand? I'm going to use all the same skills. I'm going to use curiosity. I'm going to place it from a place of trying to understand what is their perspective and what is getting in the way. And for me, with the personal experience piece, my father was a Vietnam vet and never dealt with it, became an alcoholic, very classic symptoms. And I remember vividly, he had a lot of health problems that came up. And when he went to the VA to try to get treatment, they denied him. And they said the only way he could get treatment is if it was through the mental. And he had a breakdown. There's no other way to describe it, because he had repressed all of this stuff for so long. And it was like they opened up this can, but they gave him no tools on how to deal with it. They gave him no language, no context for understanding. And I wish, he's not alive any longer, but I really wish that I had known all of the things I know now, so that I could have kind of helped him have that language and have that word and show that understanding. Nobody did that for him. And so to some of the points that other people have made, and it's not exclusive to males, obviously, but, this idea of like, you don't tell your story and now you're being forced to tell your story in order to get benefits. And okay, you might have your benefits, but at what cost? It's really, really damaging on a lot of levels. So I think my 2 minutes are probably up. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, Janine.
I wanted to talk about the fact that I had been a professional for 40 years in education. I had a PhD, I taught at the university, and then I fell down the rabbit hole because of my childhood trauma. And so the idea, several things have been mentioned along the way, the idea that I wanted attention, no, very unlikely, right? That I was sharing my story to get attention. And actually, I didn't tell anyone during the whole process of healing because I was still working. But once I retired, I realized that I could just say my story and say it the way that it needed to be said. And so I think that Karen mentioned about professionals including our story as part of this process. And I appreciate those who do, because many times the pressure is not to do that. And then to talk about the fact that it's messy. Our as we heal is very messy, and people kept calling me to just talk about the healing and talk about how wonderful it is once you're healed. And I think that so many people have written me as they read my book to say thank you for expressing how messy this actually is when you're healing. And so just so many comments. I just wanted to jump on and say, yes, we have to be open about it and tell our stories and be honest about how messy it is.
I agree. And I think it's so important. I wish all the youth and kids that I work with could hear these things, because I feel like they experience that a lot too, like being told that, they're attention seeking. And yeah, it's important to hear those stories. Carolee.
Hi. So what struck me about this one was thinking about how when I was around 14, I was told, oh, you don't have an eating disorder, you're not on drugs or alcohol, so you must be okay, which is what I was told by a psychiatrist before I went to court about a family member. And I've seen a lot of reenactment from my mum. She kind of reenacted, she got into a relationship that was abusive. I think the part of the book that that was there was if the problem with PTSD, it's page 180, I think. Yeah. If the problem with PTSD is dissociation, the goal of treatment would be association. So integrating the cut-off elements of the trauma into the ongoing narrative of life, so the brain can recognize that was then and this is now. And I think once, when I had narrative exposure therapy and the whole kind of neuroscience was explained to me, that's when I finally actually started to heal. I'd been through so many other types of therapy, but It was actually understanding what dissociation was and not being told, oh, you dissociate too much to have therapy, which is what I was told at one point as well. So it's kind of, it was really validating to read that.
Yeah, definitely. Teresa, can we hear from the YouTube channel?
Yeah, some really nice comments coming in. This one from Rachel, who said, facing trauma takes courage, but mustering that courage after facing trauma, that's the bridge between denial and healing. We had a reflection from Bobby wanting to thank Jason for sharing not being able to feel your own feelings, but being able to understand others is very powerful. And then a reflection from Raven saying, I often wonder if one of the reasons people deny trauma and or avoid taking steps to address and heal from it is because they have no idea what they have to gain once freed from the grip of trauma.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving on to discussion question 4. How does culture shape the expression of traumatic stress? And I'll repeat that one more time. How does culture shape the expression of traumatic stress? Let's see. Try to call on somebody who hasn't spoken. Jenny, you have your hand raised.
Hi, thanks. I think my hand was still up from last time, but I'll talk about this.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I actually was thinking about this in reference to a previous question about how we can elevate the conversation of post-traumatic stress and of trauma and repressed memories into the narrative. And I think one way that we're doing that is the shift we've seen in culture really in the last 10 years with social media and vulnerability, and even like sort of like a performance aspect of social media and of our social presence, so that a generation, like the World War II generation, known as the strong silent generation, you were not allowed to talk about private things. As they were mentioning earlier, men weren't supposed to have big emotions, and women who did were hysterical. And then as we've learned more, it's been more acceptable then for women then to express their feelings and to talk about why they have the big feelings that they do, as we get more into like the women's movement and things like that. And I think that the space that we're in now, the cultural shift that we're in now, praise be to Gen Z for ushering this in for us, is I am not well and I want to talk about why I'm not well because I want to be well. And that means that instead of having these inward facing, non-visible ways that traumatic stress is expressing itself, there are a lot of visible ways. And even on TikTok, there's a whole version of TikTok that is specifically about trauma and stress and PTSD and complex PTSD. And there are therapists and there are survivors and there are people who are telling their stories, which means the ability to express trauma, the ability to express these disconnects between the narrative experience and the traumatic experience are now becoming more socially acceptable for the mere fact that they're more visible. And that's a cultural shift that, say what you will about social media, but that's a cultural shift that I'm actually really grateful to see because it removes the stigma of secrecy.
I agree. Thanks, Jenny. It's done the same for me. I came around to this book as a result of hearing a podcast. It was a male who runs a well-known podcast, and he had on Dr. Richard Schwartz. It was a Tim Ferriss podcast with Dr. Richard Schwartz, and talked about internal family systems. And Tim talked about the trauma that he suffered and how he worked through it. And that's how I found my way to this book and to trauma-focused therapy. And then also I've seen several Facebook groups and Instagram accounts that I follow that that are focus on PTSD and complex PTSD. There are groups targeted just for that, and seeing the number of people that participate in those groups is allows it's just allowed me to see that I'm not alone, and I think it does the same for other people. So thanks for sharing that, Jenny. I totally agree. Let's see. Naima, you have your hand raised.
Yes, from my experience, my client come to me because they have anxiety. So this word is explain everything and nothing, and we have to unpack this. And so that's why Bestsell and this book was instrumental in my recovery and my client recovery, because finally we connect the body with this anxiety, where it's coming from, what is behind that. So yes, social media are spreading a better understanding about trauma, but still there's this misunderstanding that needs to be addressed in setting, in a therapeutic setting, for people to acknowledge that it's okay to feel what they feel, and not be scared to look what's behind how they feel. Anxiety is stigmatized as something we need to get rid of. And I take time with my client to explain that maybe this is a symbol, a sign of their body trying to say something that's been repressed and needs to be addressed and expressed. So I tend to be a bit annoyed when people talk about my anxiety. I need to get rid of it. I want to share a different approach to it, more compassionate approach to our anxiety.
Thanks, Naima. Yeah, I agree. I think that, you know, this book's done it's connected some dots for me, is quite a few dots for me as well, with respect to anxiety that I've suffered and continue to suffer. And I'm not so sure. Maybe it goes back to that question we were talking about before about societal norms, but there just does seem to be this general negative stigma about anxiety. I'm not so sure why, because it seems, you know, so wired into us naturally, you know, especially after what I learned through reading through earlier chapters about the brain, that, you know, we're just we're hardwired to be aware, and hyper aware of threats, and any traumatic events can intensify that. So thank you. Tanya, see your hand raised.
Thank you. Actually, listening to you, there are new things arising for me, and thinking about social media, what comes for me is actually one of the definitions of trauma, that it's anything that it's happening too fast, too much, too soon. And this is my experience when I am actually on social media. And this is for me a paradox, that very often the so-called therapeutic profiles or quick videos with quick solutions, there is so many of them and so much that there is no time for integration, that the same overwhelm that is symptomatic for trauma, for traumatic experience, can be re-experienced while on social media with the best intention of healing. And this is for me this paradox. And maybe that also links with the culture itself. When I think about the culture I am rooted in, almost everything is too much, too fast. It's a culture of overwhelm when it comes to expectation, when it comes to my performance that is expected from me, when it comes to input. So in this sense, I'm almost asking how this can be a healing setting. And healing, when I mean healing, I don't even only mean like a personal healing, but like a collective process. As the culture we created, that is a culture of too much, too fast, too intense. I imagine as a culture created by generations of traumatized people who created this culture as a coping mechanism as well. Maybe strange example, but when I think even about capitalism, that is about constant growth and more and intensity and gathering objects to feel safe and gathering things to feel safer. For me, even that is a trauma symptom or a adaptation to traumatic reality of many generations before. So the dream I have is like this kind of massive slowdown for our nervous system to readjust and integrate all that is happening.
Thank you, Hanya. Thank you. Yeah. I think it's imperative to curate our content carefully, because while there's access, like you said, to so many resources and groups, maybe not all of them might be as safe and helpful as a space as the one that we're currently in now, which has been curated very carefully and run by professionals. So thank you, Hanya. Okay, we have time for one more response. Ed, I see your hand raised.
I just have a small one about the expression of traumatic stress. When I was a high school teacher many years ago, I was a football coach. And a young man came up to there's a pad by the way, American football, just to keep that clear. There was a pad that you hit against. And a young man put a little blue sticker on the pad. And I looked at it and I said, "What's this all about?" He said, "My father always wears a blue shirt." And so I noticed he would be very aggressive hitting that pad. I spoke to another football coach and I said, "I'd like to talk to him. What's going on there? There's a lot of anger and things going on there." And the other coach looked at me and said, "Are you kidding, coach? This is a great way for him to channel his stress." And I wonder if our culture has these violent activities as acceptable outlets for this sort of a thing. And by the way, that's why I decided maybe my time coaching football needed to come to an end. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Ed. Let's check in with Teresa for see what's going on with the live YouTube chat.
All right, so we have some comments about our next generation. So Rachel saying the newest generation may have the assertiveness that previous generations didn't, and perhaps the newer generations are empowered by history, which Jess responded and said, "I'm scared that the newer generations are having less respect for history." Then another interesting comment from Sue. For the LGBTQ plus community, being shamed for gender identity and sexuality compounds childhood trauma, often resulting in seeking relief by using substances, eating disorders, self-harm, suicide, etc. And another quote provided by Achara from Pete Levine in Waking the Tiger. Cultures that use ritual and shamans to heal trauma may seem primitive and superstitious, but they have one important advantage. Probably. Back to you.
Thanks, Teresa. Okay, we'll move on to discussion question 5, and I'll pass this on to Whitney.
Thank you. Okay, so question 5 is, how would you explain the ways in which traumatic memories can be repressed and recovered to someone else? Again, how would you explain the ways in which traumatic memories can be repressed and recovered to someone else? Terry, I'd love to hear from you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I had a conversation with Bessel a week ago before he left on his trip, and I brought up a metaphor that he liked, and I think it's useful for this question, and that is, we all have an image in our head of what it would mean to take from a pound an extremely cruelly treated dog, take him home with the project in mind of turning him into a nice, loving dog. And we all know what we would do, right? 1 million hugs, 1 million kisses, all the things you would do to rewire his brain. And that image, we both thought, is really powerful therapeutically. He stresses in this book how the human brain is about 1/3 human and about 2/3 mammal. So about 2/3 of us, everything we do, everything we see or think, or the way our memory works is like our dog example. And about 1/3 of us is this frontal cortex, which is busy ratiating and doing language and having conversations like this one, and meetings and coordination and passing on knowledge from generation to generation and so on. But people need to know that that trauma or loneliness, what I work on, is stored in the limbic system. And that's really crucial. I think if you approach your own thoughts on the topic, or if you're a therapist, approach your clients with this idea that there are two brains at work, two memory systems at work, and they're really quite different. And the trick that Bessel and his colleagues have, I shouldn't say the trick, the method, the approach, the paradigm that they've introduced and fought for the 40 years I've been involved, is trying to get people to respect the fact that we're partly just mammals, and that we are very much, if we're traumatized as kids, like that beaten, kicked dog. And what we need to do to get well is not unrelated to what you would do as an owner, bringing that dog home from the pound with the idea of turning him into a normal, loving pet. I'll stop there.
That's a really good point. I saw, I was able to go to a workshop where we were working with horses, wild horses, and the trainer continually talked about helping the horse feel safe rather than breaking the horse, which traditionally, when they break a horse, they break the horse's spirit. But instead, continually approaching and backing away and helping the horse feel safe. And I adopted about 2 years ago our 12-year-old son, and that's the image I kept in my head the whole time. It was just safety and connection. That's all that really matters, just safety and connection and that attunement. Anyway, Nadine.
Thank you so much for that share. A quick side note, I was very blessed to have an opportunity to be participating in some equine programs in some of the residentials I've worked in, and that work is so beautiful. So I'm just kind of putting that out there for anybody who might want to look into that some more. I think for me, a big part of it is redefining this idea of trauma, and I think for sure there's still a stigma. I come up against that a lot. And so it's really just doing a lot of, I don't even use that word sometimes with some people, just maybe for a little while, because I think that there's a very specific image in their head and it feels very shaming to them, even though that's not my intention, certainly, to even just have that word put out there. And so I think when we talk about how do we begin to shift, we have to help people understand these definitions. And, I've done within my community a lot of training around this, and I use this book a ton, and, helping people to understand this. What do we mean when we talk about that? And the other thing that I think is really crucial, and kind of piggybacking on what I said earlier, is, now that we understand better the neuroscience of everything, we know that anything that's new or unfamiliar, people are going to naturally be a little defensive about, because that's just how inherently we're all wired, right? And so again, it kind of, for me, it comes at, trying to go slowly and with tons of curiosity and supportive understanding to be able to build somebody's, kind of break through those defenses a little bit so that we can explain what some of this means. We can't do that if their defenses remain intact, just like we can't help our clients or people we love if their defenses remain intact. So I think that that's a really important piece.
Karen.
Thank you. So I think when it comes to explanation is, if you know the person in particular, is use part of their story. Do you remember when X happened to you, when you tried to recount it, that you missed a few key pieces, or the next time you told the story, you told it in a different way? Well, trauma is that times 1,000, and sometimes if we can use other people's experiences, they can see it a different way and hear it a different way. So it's not about necessarily all about, it has to be a huge trauma to distort our memories. Our memories are imperfect for the average bear. So if you put something hugely horrific into someone's life, of course, they're going to try to, push that down and maybe eat a lot to stuff themselves, or maybe drink too much, or maybe use drugs. It's like anything and everything to numb the pain, because that pain is more unbearable than all the other things that they do to themselves, to punish themselves for a trauma they didn't ask for. So I hope that's helpful. I feel like a preacher today. That's not what I want to do.
Oh, great. Thank you. Jason.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I think the analogy of a dog is brilliant, because we all know that if you want to make friends with a dog and you go towards the dog, it might, it might bring a few barks in your direction and perhaps a little bit of aggression, a bit of fear. But if you just wait and let the dog approach you on his terms or her terms, then that's a much better thing. And it reminded me of something that I wouldn't recommend this to anybody. Please don't do this. But I remember doing this some years ago. There was a man in the street with a knife. And I think he had I think he was schizophrenic, but because my mother was schizophrenic, I tend to not be, it's weird because I've been affected by the fear as a child, but I'm also comfortable around mental illness. If that makes sense. Sounds like a dual thing going on. But I remember going outside and just talking to him, perfectly normal. He's got a big knife in his hand. And we sat down on these steps and I said, do you think, perhaps we should just get the police and let them just come and just sort everything out, and how do you feel about that? And we just had this nice little chat. And because somehow, by accident, I believe, I found a safe space for both of us and for him, and he felt that he got to the end of his road of what he was doing. But I think that's the thing, is trying to find a safe space. And it can be different for different people what the safe space is, but you find the safe space and then you're in the position to actually do something to help. So it's just interesting just what's been said.
Yeah, very good point. That's totally agree. Let's see, and Teresa, do we have some YouTube live comments?
Yes, indeed. So Holly shared with us, I feel survivors are expert at re-traumatizing ourselves because we know those stressful on edge feelings so well. I run from feelings of calmness because anxiety instead is so familiar. And then Seth said, as a therapist, one of the most powerful ways to help others heal, and myself, is to write in detail about anything we found of comfort, beauty, or pleasure in our day. Maybe it's a meal, a walk, a conversation. And one more from Achara. I found song and story to be extremely healing within my own healing experience and with clients, as their bodies naturally respond with tears, joy, tingling sensations of joy, and more. Back to you.
Love that. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to discussion question 6. Why do you think modern society remains hesitant to acknowledge the impact of trauma? I'll repeat one more time. Why do you think modern society remains hesitant to acknowledge the impact of trauma? Ed, you have your hand raised.
I think it's difficult for people to come to grips with trauma. I discovered I'd been traumatized by sitting with a therapist many years ago, and he said to me, do you realize you were seriously physically abused? And the shock of that moment overwhelmed me, even though I completely knew what had happened. But to put a name to it overwhelmed me. I really think it's a form of denial. We just don't want to deal with it because it's not easy to deal with. It's a lot easier to deal with the superficial things. I saw teachers say, well, he acts out in my class. And when I've taught teachers candidates, I've said, well, let's go beneath the surface and find out why he's doing this. That's a lot harder to do. And I hear a lot of teachers saying, I don't have time for that with 30 students in my class. So unfortunately, I think it's something we're scared to deal with. It might be a big, messy thing. I'm also shocked at how much abuse there is out there. It's not as isolated as I thought it was when I was being abused. As I said, all my years being a high school teacher, I thought I'd heard it all. And every year I was surprised by something even more. That's my thought.
Thank you, Ed. Quite a few hands raised on this one too. So we'll try to call on as many as possible. It's a great question. Jenny, you have your hand raised.
Hi, thanks. The first thought that came to mind for me on this question was actually what Bessel referenced in the previous part of the book, and that was the idea that it's very difficult to get someone to understand something if their salary depends on them not understanding it. Mm-hmm. And so that's Upton Sinclair, I believe. That's not me. But I feel like the industry that we have in the United States, I can only speak for the United States, the medical industrial complex that we have, the prison industrial complex that we have, they're all based on revenue, and it pays in the short term to keep people traumatized and to keep treating their symptoms, as opposed to facing the dramatic overhaul we would have to do of all of these infrastructures in order to address the actual problem. And then layered on top of that, which is very near and dear to my own personal experience, was the ability to rally around men in power, white men particularly in power, because that's the status quo. And in order to receive and understand the complexities of trauma, that's going to unseat anyone anywhere. There's no protected population in that. And that's a really difficult thing, I think, for society, a white patriarchal society that the United States is, in order to like undo the capitalism and the way that our entire nation was built. We pull the rug out from underneath it if we start to acknowledge the grand impact that trauma is having on all of us.
Thanks for saying that, Jenny. Yeah, I fully agree. And, you know, there are certainly powers that be that, you know, that benefit from the way things currently are. And to reference something that was mentioned earlier in the book, you know, I just found the ubiquity of trauma shocking. You know, the CDC stats on incest victims and sexual abuse victims alone. I don't want to say the incorrect stats, but I just remember how shocking I was to hear those numbers. And to see, you know, to juxtapose that with how popular actually combating trauma is through methods mentioned in this book and how we're discussing, the juxtaposition between those two things is disturbing. But, you know, I'm just glad that we're here trying to make progress. Janine, I see you have your hand raised.
One of the things that I find is that it has to do with behavior. And as an educator, we have been pretty determined as teacher educator for years we never talked about trauma. We never talked about the effects of trauma. And we believe that children were choosing bad behavior. And we did not understand the reenactments. We did not understand neurobiology. We didn't understand any of that. And so we were really at a loss to explain it any other way. And so we did a lot of behavior modification, which is totally ineffective for trauma. And I also do a lot of work with churches. And the hardest thing for religious people to accept is that we are not always in control of our behavior. That when it comes to trauma, that our behaviors are sometimes reenactments, our behaviors are sometimes living out of that trauma. So I think that for me, one of the big things that I try to express to people is that we can't judge behavior. We have to understand trauma in order to have compassion for it.
Thanks, Janine. Yeah, because there is that connection between past and present when it comes to behavior. And yeah, totally agree. I you know, for you know, referencing the behavior modification that you mentioned, that totally ignores that the past is connected to the present. So, Caitlin, I see your hand raised.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. And I think we've looked at this from the perspective of it's hard to acknowledge that you have been a victim of trauma, and it's hard to acknowledge how many people have actually been victims of trauma. But I think it's also, we're hesitant to acknowledge that actually the people around us that we might love are capable of inflicting harm on us or other people. And I think the idea that this is much more common than we're able to acknowledge means that there is a lot more people around that potentially that have harmed others. And then what does that actually mean? There are people that we we love, or people that we are in our workplaces, in our homes and things like that. And I think that comes back to what we were discussing earlier about how we actually deal with trauma. And if it is really just from this carceral perspective, then not everybody wants or is able to, go through a court case or something like that for someone who has harmed them. And yeah, I think it just means that there's just not a structure in place to deal with people who have harmed others. How do they then come to terms with that? And how do they move forward in a way that's not just, they might go to prison or something like that. So I think that is part of the reason we're hesitant to acknowledge it.
Sure, Caitlin, no, thank you. I agree. Carrie Lee, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so similar to what Janine said, I think that schools are, a place that really, it's kind of like there needs to be a whole shift in everything. And I think the stigma is still there. There's still so much of that. And I think it's expensive. So in the UK, as part of the NICE guidelines, the clinical excellence guidelines, they're trying to kind of do this quick fix. So the training I did was to do kind of quick fix therapy for anxiety and low mood. And because trauma can't be fixed in 6 to 8 sessions, it's easier to ignore it and kind of, put it out there and brush it under the carpet. And when we were trained, I was quite shocked that we had nothing about trauma in our training. And the training that we did around behavior advocated time out. And it's kind of, now I've realized how damaging that can be for some children. And I find it quite difficult that even the mental health kind of field still aren't really acknowledging it, and the education field as well. So
Thanks, Carrie Lee. Nance, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I think, I think what we're realizing, and I hope each day, each year, how pervasive trauma is, that we're all affected by trauma. And someone in the first book club said that trauma is the great unifier. And unless you're into the trauma Olympics, and you want to fight about who's the more traumatized, I feel like we've hit bottom, and so in that sense, you're like, we've got to do something about it. I live in Minneapolis, and of course, this is where George Floyd was murdered by the police. And I was in a meeting. We're trying to work on that. So we stop killing Black people. And someone said that. They said, well, we've known it's a terrible city, as our whole country is. We've known this has been going on all this time, but it took that to hit bottom. And it did wake a lot of people up. I just, I want us to stay waking, keep waking ourselves up, and a beautiful, courageous stories. I'll go back to that point that has been made several times, telling the stories more and more and more, and being vulnerable and personal. That's what's gonna change it.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, I totally agree. I think being vulnerable is what's going to change it. And I think at least in our society, in our culture, change tends to happen more often when thought leaders or people in positions of power initiate the change. And part of me wonders if those people, at least a large portion of them, maybe they suffered trauma in the past, but if they're in a position of power, maybe they don't want to talk about their trauma for fear of making themselves too vulnerable for losing the power that they have. So change happens much slower as a result. So thanks for sharing that. And Teresa, let's check in with the YouTube live chat.
Hey, there's some comments that we have coming in. Is from Heather. When normal is abused, people don't know how to treat symptoms when we get positive negativity and gaslighting. Safety is a felt sense that you cannot fake, and that involves information and training. From Rachel, if society had a more open and fluid understanding of trauma, I think we would open the door to improve programs, therapy structure, and therapist training. And from Jeff, a lot of people can't acknowledge trauma because they live life for so long thinking this was their normal. Back to you.
Thank you, Teresa. So I think, Whitney, I think that just about wraps up our time. So I think we need to move on to the closing. So so I just want to say thank you for everybody for joining in on YouTube today, and our panelists for joining us. This is a tremendous conversation, and I really like what we were talking about with vulnerability. I think having these discussions in a public forum is really important to initiate change. And I'm just glad to be a part of it because I want to see change happen. So, I'm going to do my part too, and come here to learn from you all and to connect with everybody and to create that sense of community, which I think really helps initiate the change. So, so thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. I'll pass this over to Whitney for closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. I've had so many thoughts. I'm just thinking about that last question and how, in regards to our society, how people in positions of power and privilege, one of the biggest problems that exists with that, I think, is not being willing to try to understand and experience because we don't experience it personally. And so I'll leave with the Bessel van der Kolk's words, and he says, in order to understand trauma, we have to overcome our natural reluctance to confront that reality and cultivate the courage to listen to testimonies of survivors.
100%. Thank you, Whitney. So once again, thanks for everybody for joining us. Next week, we'll be discussing part 5, Pathways to Recovery, chapters 13 through 20, and The Body Keeps the Score. And anybody who is on the panel currently is, we have your availability. So we'll send out an email early next week to curate another panel for next week's discussion. If you are in the YouTube live chat, once again, if you are in the TRF book club and would like to participate as a panelist, you can click the link in the welcome email that you received if you'd like to be on the panel. We'd love to have you. And in the meantime, please contact programs at Trauma Research Foundation for any general questions. And thank you for attending. And Teresa, did you have any closing remarks on behalf of TRF?
You covered everything. Just a reminder that you can check the form that's dropped in the YouTube chat to apply as a panelist. And yeah, lastly, really big thanks to our facilitators, Whitney and Brendan. It's really a pleasure to have you guys holding this container every week. And a big thanks to the rest of the TRF team, Pat, Nicole, Christopher, everyone that's making this book club happen. And everyone that's participating on YouTube. It's really great to be in discussions with you all. So, thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you, everyone.